learn about how to emphasize a focal point. So we're going to talk about what a focal point actually is, because focal points are a really great way to guide the viewer's attention to a certain point in your artwork. All right, so if we talk about what a focal point is, I want you to think about a focal point as the center of visual interest. An easier way to think about this is the focal point is the first thing that captures your attention in an artwork. Sometimes there's multiple things that will capture your attention, but the very first thing that captures your attention is referred to as the primary focal point. The next thing that captures your attention is the secondary focal point, and so on. Some people believe that the focal point is located in the center of an artwork, which could happen, but that's not always the case. What you're looking for is the very first thing that grabs your attention and makes you look to a certain part of an artwork. When we talk about different strategies to identify and to direct the viewer's attention to a focal point, one of the first strategies we can speak about is contrast. Contrast is an extreme difference between two elements of art. People often limit contrast to just, the difference between black and white. Yeah, that's an extreme contrast. That is an extreme difference, which is a type of contrast. But it could also be an extreme contrast in texture, really smooth against a very rough texture. It could be an extreme contrast in line, a lot of very straight horizontal lines against a very kind of flowing curved line. So when we have a sharp difference between two different elements of art, that creates contrast. So in this example here, we could argue that there could be different focal points. It all depends kind of what stands out to you first. One of the first things I see is this white megaphone. I could justify that this is the focal point of the artwork because I could say the artist has used a contrasting shape, which is a very sharp geometric circular shape, against all these kind of flowing, curved body shapes within the artwork. Or I could also say this megaphone is the focal point because it is such a light color, it's virtually white, against a dark, or in this case black, background. The extreme difference makes it stand out. In the past, students have told me that this is the first thing they see, this kind of red jacket in the bottom corner. And they say it stands out because it's such a bright color in comparison to the dark, cool colors. So we have this kind of bluish purple, blue, lots of blacks, kind of muted brown, gold colors. But this is the only example of a very intense, warm red color. So this could also be considered the focal point because it captures our attention due to the contrast in the color. Other students have told me they see this head first, that this actually stands out to them as the focal point because of the texture. This artwork is a collage piece, and you can see that all the skin tones are very smooth, or the skin areas are smooth, the fabric is very smooth. But when we look at the head of this sculpture, it has a very kind of rough texture to imitate curly hair. So again, some students have told me, I see this as the very first thing in the artwork because of the contrast of all the smooth textures to the one kind of rougher texture up here. What I want you to know when it comes to identifying a focal point is there's no right or wrong answer as long as you're able to explain why that particular part of an artwork stands out to you first. So one strategy we have for creating a focal point is contrast. You may choose to write down the definition here at the end, at the bottom of the slide, or you can make your own notation based on what I've said. But you will need to have all of the strategies that are mentioned in this video, some sort of notes in your sketchbook, because I'm going to be referring to them with our next artwork. So here's another strategy for creating a focal point. There's two examples, could be leading lines or converging lines. I think it's pretty obvious in this one, I mean, it'd be hard to argue against it, that the man on the cyclist or the figure on the cyclist is the focal point. Now, we could say the artist has used contrast because this is a dark black blob against a whole bunch of kind of lighter gray tones behind it. So we could argue that it's contrast, but another technique that's being demonstrated here is lines that lead to the focal point. So if we look at the line of this railing, it directs our attention right to this cyclist, as well as this kind of cobblestone curb brings our eye to the cyclist. This railing here comes around, curves, and points towards the cyclist. And you could even go as far to say that the stairs are angled. Now they do keep going down, but there's a definite sharp point here in this stair that leads our eye to the cyclist. And even the road itself, the kind of different tones of the pavement are leading our eye, to the cyclist. So another strategy is when there's lines. In this case, it's a photograph. So the artist didn't, paint these in. They just happened to take the photograph at the right time where all the lines were leading towards the cyclist. If in your own artwork, you could intentionally include different types of lines to direct your viewer to what you want them to see first. The other type of lines are converging lines. Converging lines come together and all meet at the same point. In this example, the end of the bridge is the focal point, because you can see here, this is another photograph example, that all of these lines are converging or coming together at the end of the bridge. This one and this one and this one, you get the idea. So that's another strategy as well. So far we have contrast, leading lines, and converging lines. Moving along, I'm going to move my bubble so you can see the whole artwork. Here we have another strategy referred to as isolation. When you place something on its own, it stands out. This is perhaps not the strongest example, but I would argue that this figure here, this child figure, becomes the focal point. Because although there is this large figure in the foreground is the area that's closest to us that we can see as the viewer. So there's this large figure in the foreground. This little child is all by themselves. The only thing that's surrounding them is very minimal setting detail. We see some sort of plank flooring, perhaps an open door, but we don't even get to see the face of this adult that is helping the child to walk. And this figure here is not even looking in the direction of the child. The child is very much isolated, and when something is by itself, it naturally draws our attention towards it within an artwork. Our next strategy, this one I think is one of the easier ones, is the unusual. When there is something strange, weird, wacky, it just doesn't make sense, well, guess what? It grabs your attention. Because as a viewer, I look at this artwork and I say, why is there an apple floating in front of this man's face? I don't see that in my everyday life. That's pretty strange. That's pretty bizarre. So by including an element of the unusual, it makes the viewer question why it's there, and it draws their attention to that particular component. If I were to ask you what the secondary focal point is within this painting, I would argue that it is the man's tie. So the unusual dominates our attention first with the floating apple, but again, red is such a demanding color, and especially given that it's contrasting against this very stark white and this very dark black suit, this, I would argue, becomes a secondary focal point. We will cover color and certain principles of color in an upcoming lesson, but I want you to understand that from all the colors in the rainbow, red is the most visually demanding color. It demands our attention more so than any other color. That's why stop signs are painted red to grab your attention. That's why lights, when you want to stop, have a red light, because humans are naturally, genetically created to look towards red before any other color. All right, final thing. So those are our strategies. We had, again, to recap, contrast, leading lines, converging lines, isolation, and then we have the unusual. 5 strategies. This final example, I'm going to show you how having multiple focal points can actually guide the viewer's attention throughout an artwork. So I would argue here that the primary focal point, the first area that grabs my attention, is this farmhand's shirt. Again, the reason I just told you, it's red, and naturally my eye wants to go to the red color, especially because it's the only red that's being used within the painting. So it's a kind of like contrast. From here, if I was to follow the lines, so I see this farmhand, and then I kind of see a little bit of the machinery he's working with, and I'm also following the lines in the road, and it leads me to the horse. So my eye is now moving to the left. From the horse, I see this vertical line of the tree. So next, my eye is going up, and it's following some of the branches of the tree until it comes to this rocky cliff. It stops the rocky cliff, because this is also where the tree stops, and then the rocky cliff starts to decline and come down here towards the water. Within the water is this larger ship. Then I notice over here there's a little patch of yellow, so this is presumably a sun coming up, and then it leads my eye over to this ship, which is much more detailed, again following the vertical line coming down the mast of the ship, and then there's this kind of funky, I'm not sure if this is roots or some sort of, tree over here, perhaps a person swimming, this kind of limb that's sticking out, and it kind of brings me right back to my primary focal point. So it's a little bit of a cycle. The artist has kind of given me a direction on how I should view the artwork. So I see every single component within the artwork. And we refer to this as placement. So the deliberate placement of certain points of interest to guide the viewer's attention throughout an artwork. So again, here is just a little recap of some focal point strategies. I would like you to please take some notes. Jot notes are for your purposes only. I'm not going to mark your notes. So write down what makes sense to you. If you want to shorten it, if you need to write the definitions word by word, you need to make sure you have notations, because we will be talking about this in the future and employing these strategies in one of our upcoming artworks. Good luck with your focal point notes.